Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse.
And I'm Emily Burt. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. And this week we'll be hearing from the Chief Executive of UK Youth about the need for a more joined-up charity sector. And later on, in Charity Changed My Life, we'll hear how one family was supported by For Baby's Sake, a charity that exists to help families break the cycle of domestic abuse and give their baby the best start in life.
But going straight into our main discussion this week, we talk a lot on this podcast about the need for greater levels of collaboration between voluntary sector organisations, be it driven by funders, big charities sharing the pie with smaller counterparts and vice versa, and many things in between. But in the youth sector, there's a new initiative to push for this at a systemic level to fix the fragmented system of support for young people in this country. And we're delighted to be joined by Ndidi Okezie. She's the Chief Executive of UK Youth, a network that champions youth work as a catalyst for change for young people. And it's also the convener of this new initiative called the Joined Up Institute. Hi, Ndidi. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, both of you. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, we're not talking simply about collaboration here. Can you tell us about your vision for a more joined up youth sector?
Yeah, absolutely. The term collaboration has been used so much that I think it's probably lost all sorts of meaning for people. And so there's not necessarily a shared understanding when you hear that word. So I think we're going beyond collaboration here. And we're talking about the fact that, we do have a system that offers fragmented support, siloed services to young people. And ultimately, those, therefore, systems of support are failing the complex needs of young people. So we really need a more strategically integrated approach that brings all of the different players around young people together in a far more intentional way. And so, you think about obviously what COVID did, the fact that it has exacerbated existing challenges faced by young people, whether they be mental health issues, educational disparities, employment prospects. But we actually are operating in a system where there is proven research and evidence about what works for young people in those specific topic areas. But that information is not reaching professionals, it's not reaching practitioners in an effective way. And so the need for a joined up approach is actually far more around understanding what works for young people and making sure that regardless of what jigsaw piece you offer to young people, you are aware of the complementary other pieces and you're really aware of your role, but ultimately what works. And so we think that by bringing professionals together to really understand what evidence says, to really understand what research shows, and then help them translate that into their own practice. So rather than like a conference or this like one-off event, this is actually about bringing people together in spaces they wouldn't necessarily self-select or know to self-select, but then holding their hands through that learning as well and helping them implement the solutions in their context, but with a much broader understanding of the other contexts that sit around them.
Now, I think you spoke there about the many upheavals that the youth sector has been through in recent years, which has brought it to this very turbulent state, which we're in right now. And I think we're seeing a lot of the same themes playing out across the voluntary sector as a whole. And I'm sure there's lots of messaging in the work that you're doing that could also be applied to the wider charity sector as well. I'm really interested, what do you think are the chief barriers that are currently stopping organisations from working together in these ways? Because for me, it seems like a really clear solution to organisations that are so resource poor, that can be so cash poor, and that are struggling to survive. So what's stopping this?
It's that classic saying of, I didn't have enough time to write you a shorter note, right?
Right.
The reality is that people are on their knees, people are head down, people are fighting fires, people are trying to figure out the best solution for their beneficiaries. And they ironically don't have time to do the most effective things. And again, this is why we have to figure out a different way into this problem and this issue. We've been circling this dynamic, this reality of being cash poor, resource poor, time poor for so long. So for us, the reason for the Joined Up Institute, which is something that we're championing, is that I think there does need to be a top-down offer that creates that space that really allows people to lift their heads up and really understand what is not working about the current practice. So you will hear all sorts of things. Obviously, the money is so tight, so everyone's kind of can be slightly crabs in a barrel type of mentality, which obviously doesn't help anybody. You hear funders saying they don't want this reality, but yet perpetuating it with the approach that they use, whether they have to or not. So everybody steps back and says, oh, this is ridiculous. But anyway, let's go. And just kind of carries on with that madness. And so I think there just needs to be something that kind of steps into the noise and says, actually, let's signpost a different way, let's spotlight a different way. And I think that leadership is needed to do that. You know, we've been working on this, we've been piloting this, we've been thinking about Joined Up for over 2 years now. And it's fascinating that anyone that you speak to nods furiously and says, absolutely, this is what's needed. But then when it's time to kind of take that next step, like, who's going to do it? What needs to, everyone's like, oh, I don't have time. I think there just needs to be a kind of an offer given to the sector that says, stop, create some space to think about a better way.
And how do you envisage the Joined Up Institute doing that? Like, practically speaking, what's going to happen? You've mentioned that you've done some pilots, and I think it's in the autumn, isn't it, that you're properly launching the programme?
Yeah, so the Institute is a much kind of bigger vision of, as I said, of this static thing that exists that is all about that evidence into action learning, helping to unlock what works for young people and drive transformational change across sectors. In November, on November the 7th, we are bringing together a gathering of 500 decision makers from across education, youth, business, government, civil society generally for the Joined Up Summit. And these are all sectors who we know are united by a common mission to scale opportunities and positive outcomes for young people in local communities. So the summit is about coming together in Birmingham to say, we know what works. And so we're spotlighting and platforming case studies where people have come together in a really constructive, intentional cross-sector way and delivered transformational change for local communities and young people. And so we're really asking people who in the room have the decision-making power, and we're asking them to say, right, what do you need to do to commit to scaling this? What do you need to do to commit to fueling this so that we can stop humming and hawing when we see young people and we see communities in disarray and we scratch our heads and we mumble for a little bit about how awful all of it is. And then we all go back to our lives. There are real clinically evident solutions that have been tested, that have been proven, and yet the problem seems to be a lack of will to say, let's scale this, let's make sure every young person has access to this solution. That's what we really want the summit to be, a moment, a call to action where decisions need to be made. That is where we will also launch the Institute, which we believe will launch in its entirety in spring of 2025.
And you were talking there about the fact that case studies are going to be a really important part of this summit. And I was wondering if you could share with us now any examples that you might have of like a case study or where you have seen this working together approach like in action and the sort of results that has actually returned.
Yeah, absolutely. So, actually there are quite a few examples where you can see, this happening. And again, it goes beyond, I think when people think about, where are examples of collaboration?
Mm-hmm.
You can find collaboration within a school. You can find collaboration within one organization. That's, collaboration, hopefully, is how we all operate. Again, I'm talking about something that is a slightly bigger scale. And so one of the great examples, I think, is an organization called Right to Succeed. And they have an initiative called Cradle to Career. And it really is about identifying local places and thinking about how you bring residents, local services, professionals, community leaders, youth workers, education, and young people people together to identify what this local community needs and figure out a strategic plan where they all know their roles, but they're very aware of each other. And one really powerful example is North Birkenhead. So it's kind of cradle to career in North Birkenhead. There's a really powerful video if anyone wants to check that out. But, it really is this long-term, multi-year commitment that has, obviously it's resourced and invested, but it is all these individuals coming together. And when you hear them speak, the impact is that, number one, they all say the significance understanding each other more has had on them. So when you hear social services say, of course, I understood the role of education and youth work, but actually, through this initiative, I'm walking hand in hand with these professionals. We have a shared goal we're working with. And by the way, the young people that we're serving are right with us as well. So we are co-creating solutions, but then actually executing them together as well. And you hear the young people talk about the impact it's had on them to work alongside their teachers in a slightly different way to what would happen within school, work alongside youth workers in terms of really identifying the solutions, and the local community coming together. And it's all about, how do we make North Birkenhead a place where young people feel proud to be? There's a really powerful part of the case study that talks about, in the kind of initial research, young people saying nothing good happens to anyone from North Birkenhead. Right? There's no opportunities for us here. And at the end of it, simply by recognizing they have a voice and that they have agency, you hear these young people suddenly realizing, no, obviously all the problems are not magically fixed, but the agency they have, the validity that they feel because they're working alongside professionals is transformational. It's transformational for the way they think about their own lives. It's transformational for the behaviors that they then display. This is an area that is plagued with all the issues that many of us would again scratch our heads about. But rather than there just being a forceful intervention, as it were, it is about giving people agency and recognizing that we all have a role to play in transforming the areas that we live.
That sounds like a really exciting initiative and case study. And how is it possible for something like this, from cradle to career, to happen successfully with all of these different stakeholders playing their part and making sure that it comes off the ground? How can you move to that action, to that change, to that tangible progress, and away from the discussions and the talk shops and the commitment, verbal commitment, that then isn't translated into action? How does something like this happen when so many others fail?
I love that question. And this is exactly where we think something like the Joined Up Institute comes in, because there are two barriers to that problem. One is awareness, right? So there are many people who have no idea that the Cradle to Career North Birkenhead is a spotlight, is a kind of a green shoot of an idea. And so there is something about how we amplify evidence of what works. That's number one, right? So awareness. So there could be lots of areas that are thinking, oh my goodness, like, what could we do? What could it look like for us to kind of take a strategic approach to our local area? And they might even be spending energy trying to blue sky that, figure that out. They see something like this and they think, oh my goodness, that's exactly what we need, right? So awareness, exposure and awareness is the first barrier to scale. And then obviously, aside from will and the kind of, quality people, it is resources. It is investment in the infrastructure to underpin that journey. And so for us, again, something like the Joined Up Institute, it needs money, it needs commitment, it needs leadership. But the thing that I would say is we are already spending resources, right? Apart from the fact that none of us think we have enough resources, fair enough, but we are expending energy, money, time. The question is the way that we are expending that effective? And the reality is, in so many instances, it's not. So it's about redeploying those resources that we are currently expending in a far more effective way. And so I really do think there is a build it and they will come aspect of this, which I think we need to demonstrate the power of this. And as I said, each time that we do it in any small way, we have seen the response. We have seen people saying, oh my goodness, this is exactly what's needed. How do we sustain this? How do we make this more systematic and integrated? And so I think that all of those things are needed for scale to occur. But the one thing that I would say is, remember, the whole framing of this is, researchers hate it when I say this, because I really understand there's a lot more research that needs to be done. But the whole framing of this is, we know enough about what works to be getting on with. Right? Like, that's my challenge. There is enough evidence out there. There is enough tangible proof points to be getting on with. And so before we focus more on the gaps, which are 100% there, my goodness, we could be making so much more progress if we could be more intentional about turning evidence into action.
I think what you've said there is something that's going to really resonate with anyone listening to this podcast, which is just like, it needs money. Right, it's the eternal thing that we hear so much about in the sector when it comes to development, when it comes to strategy, when it comes to innovation and working in new ways. It needs money. And you mentioned earlier in this interview about the fact that funders have currently a part to play in keeping organisations in these siloed spaces. So I would love to know, what role do you think that funders, be it government funding, independent funders, have when it comes to actually getting these organisations out of their bubbles and actually promoting and supporting that systemic change in a way that is really sustainable?
Yeah, so again, I think this is an area where the conversation feels slightly secular in nature. Like, we constantly are having this debate and this. And so I'm personally somebody who's always intrigued about what conversations are not happening, what haven't we been doing? And so, yes, there is a myriad of ways that funders could be more effective. I think a lot of them are aware of that. They just need to make the decision, whether that's, unrestricted funding, long-term funding, multi-year fund, all of those things I think are proven at this point. And any funder that's not doing that, I think really has to search within in terms of the impact they're trying to make. The question I have for funders now is, how much of your resources are going towards turning evidence into action? So much funding is about trying to generate evidence. I say, in all the rooms I go into now, I'm sure your reports could fill shelves, right? Because we've all moved online. I don't think we really understand the volume of evidence and reports. All the reports you make, all your grantees write, all of these wonderful things, great. They sit on shelves and then everyone moves on. So my question is, how do you turn those shelves into more impact? How do you ensure that the evidence and the insights that you have gathered is now able to do more work? How do you get more for the investment that you've had? And so for me, there is something about how much of your funding is directed towards investing in work that is about helping translate evidence into action for more people. If you ask lots of funders, they don't have an answer to that. They don't have a solution for that. And that for me is a real problem. And I say funders, I say it to all of us as organisations as well. UK Youth, we write reports for our programmes. We shouldn't be writing reports just for funders. We have reports that other parts of our network would benefit from, other sectors would benefit from. So all organisations, I think, have to ask themselves that question. Once the report's written, what next? What happens with that insight? And I think there needs to be far more energy placed on scaling insights, translating those insights so that they reach more frontline practitioners and they reach more young people, local community beneficiaries, whoever they might be for you. That would be my challenge to funders at this stage.
And you focus on the youth space, but I think so much of what you've just said can be applied across the entire voluntary sector and beyond. But I wondered if you had any specific learnings from the youth work that you've seen, that you've been engaged in, that you think can be applied to the wider voluntary sector in terms of how we can work better together.
Yeah, I think for us, when I started at UK Youth, I came from education. My background is education. I've been a teacher. I did the Teach First program, but in its very first year, 2003. So I'm incredibly ancient at this point. But, I spent 10 years in the education system. I was a school leader. I then went to work for the charity. I worked so much on school leadership and local communities and really trying to actually address the barriers to impact, which for us at the time still were workload, the amount of pressure that is placed on this one sector. And ironically, it wasn't until I came into the youth sector that I really understood how siloed we were in the kind of educational pursuit. And so the whole strategy that we've worked on at 5 years at UK Youth has been unlocking youth work as the kind of catalyst for change that young people deserve and, need right now. And the key tenets for us around that was that we needed to lift our heads up as a sector. We needed to look beyond ourselves. And so I would say that to everybody, that there is something very intoxicating about feeling as if you are the key solution in the problem that you're trying to solve, that you are the difference maker. And apart from it being an incredibly naive thing to think, it's just not effective. And so for me, there is something, I think, the journey that the youth sector has been on, and, not just UK Youth, so many other organizations have done that, is that we have really, rather than like licking our own wounds and thinking about, the fact that we're the underdog and that, most of the time we're not called into rooms that we need to be in because of the difference that the sector makes. I think we started really thinking about how we can be a solution to other spaces and to other people's needs. And so I think trying to come in to conversations and into spaces that you might need to knock on the door really hard, or you might need to kind of invite yourself in and do that in a really humbling way. I think we have seen the impact of that. We have seen other sectors recognizing the role of youth work. And I think there is something for all of us in that, where how much of your strategic development, how much of your time is spent lifting your head up and out and thinking about what others can offer you in terms of insight and what you can offer others in terms of insight. I think we have really seen the value of that as a youth sector over the last few years and, obviously beyond that time as well. And I would really invite others to be very deliberate about that, pitting ourselves against each other. Civil society does it with business. We do it with policy. Everyone is so concerned about the way that they are perceived and the kind of the challenges that they face. That it's very easy to create an us and them dynamic. You can't tell me a single beneficiary that benefits from that, right? Like this idea that like we have to fight our own corner. There's just something counterproductive about it. I actually think it's one of the biggest weaknesses of the third sector generally, and others as well. I've worked in business, I've worked in all other sectors, and we all do it. And there's something so counterproductive is the only word I can think of. So I just really encourage us to be really intentional about creating the time to lift our heads up, look out, be in a learning posture, and ask ourselves what we can learn from others, but also what we can bring. Every single sector has something of value to offer others, but we have to be bold and confident enough to like lift our hands up and say, no, actually, we've got insight for you. How do we help you engage with that?
And I guess it's just a case then of having somebody or some organizations putting their hands up and saying, we're going to take the lead in creating a space for this work to happen.
100%. That is it. Like there really does need to be bold leadership, and it's difficult, right? Like all the things we've talked about, it's difficult to lift your head up. It's difficult to not think about survival and prioritize yourself. But I think we have to keep asking ourselves, how is it working for us? Like, how is it working? If this was working, there wouldn't be this conversation. Like, move on. It's not working. The way that we are currently set up, the way that we are currently delivering our work is not working at scale. The impact on local communities, the impact on the beneficiaries that we are focused on continues to be more complex, continues to be more all-consuming. There just has to be another way. And I just think it's time. I used to think during COVID, I thought, if there was any silver lining of COVID, it was that all the sacred cows were laid down. Like there was just no other, we can't do that. That's not the way it's done. And we've picked up some sacred cows back up, right? Like we've put them back in place, and God forbid we need another pandemic to help us recognize that. Why are they sacred cows, right? So anyone listening, again, I would say, what is the sacred cow that you think is like immovable, has to be the way? And what would happen if you just thought exercised it away and just imagine that wasn't there. What would we do instead? That, I think, is something that, again, I think we should all be challenging ourselves to do.
For most of this conversation, I've had that image of crabs in a barrel in my mind, and now I've got sacred cows added as well.
Excellent.
Yes.
Very evocative. Anyway, Ndidi, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for such a thought-provoking discussion.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Ndidi, and now we move on to Charity Changed My Life, in which we bring you the stories of people whose lives have been transformed for the better thanks to the work of charities. This week, we hear from someone who received life-changing support from the charity For Baby's Sake in the first 2 years of their son's life. And I'd like to warn you that this account contains references to domestic abuse.
Therapy was something I was wanting to do, and I'd looked into doing that therapy before I was pregnant, and oftentimes there's a waiting list. So it just so happened that the time that I did go and see that therapist, I'd just become pregnant. And the thing that led me to For Baby's Sake was an incident I had with my partner where both of our issues at the same time came to the surface. And unfortunately, the incident escalated, as in, crosswords turned to something physical, which I'd never experienced in my life. And it was a real shock for both of us. Like, what the hell was that? How did we get here? The therapist knew of For Baby's Sake, and the next thing I know, I was put in the good hands. I think what I found amazing about For Baby's Sake is that both my partner and I were having a parallel experience. So he had somebody that was holding space for him. I had somebody that was holding space for me. And then we were able to communicate. So I was able to bring the issues in my relationship to my counselor so that I could then process what I had going on inside of my relationship, but not in my relationship. I had another place to do that. And it really enabled myself and my partner to be able to come back together sort of quite cleansed, really. We were able to sort of detoxify, and we had a way in which to express ourselves because, we had that support. My child is a product of For Baby's Sake in many ways. What it did is it protected him from the repercussions of these types of incidents. Domestic violence in the home can completely derail a child. And because we had all the support we needed, we were able to be present for our child. The best thing that For Baby's Sake did for me was create a pathway to healing. For Baby's Sake comes in and recognizes that there are, lots of root causes and lots of components that add up to these types of things happening. And then with that understanding, we were able to build a foundation.
That was an account of how For Baby's Sake changed one family's situation for the better. And if you'd like your organisation to be featured in Charity Changed My Life, we'd love to hear from you. All it takes is a short voice message from someone who has benefited from your services. You can find details of how to get in touch in the show notes to this episode.
That's it for this week. We'll be back next week to follow a day in the life of a charity data analyst. But for now, thank you to our guest, Ndidi Okezie. Our producer is Nav Pal.